All right, welcome back. It's part 2 of chapter 16, and we're still talking about the South and the slavery controversy. And in the first part of this chapter, we talked about slave life and a little bit about what it's like to be a slave on the plantation and how many slaves there were, where those slaves were in the United States. And we know that they were in the southern states, and we know especially along the Mississippi River, there were a lot of slaves down there. And that slave life was hard. They worked 70, 75 hours a week, sometimes 18-hour days. They worked 265 days a year. It's just a hard life. So we're going to now talk about, in the second thread of this, we're going to continue to talk about slave and the slave life, but also kind of slavery in the country as a culture. So looking at part 2, if we look at this first slide in part 2, slavery under fire, meaning it's that people are pushing to end it. And this first slide, you can see a list from 1794, France abolishes slavery at the very top. If you look all the way down to the bottom, you see each of these is a time when slavery ended. But in the United States, we continued to have slavery until 1865. There was a war, of course, in 1861, but we talk about that a couple chapters from now. Looking at the next slide, we're comparing the North and the South, and we're going to spend just a moment looking at this comparison. And I want you to use your textbook. And so I'm going to have you pause. And what I want you to do is write what's called a T-chart. So you draw a line across the top of your paper, and you draw a line down the middle of your paper. And on one side, I want you to write the word North. And on the other side, I want you to write the word South. And I want you to compare things that are similar and things that are different between the North and the South. And then so pause it now, and after you're done pausing and writing down those things, turn it back on, and let's talk about some of those things. All right, so what did you get? Well, you should have got a whole bunch of stuff and using your textbooks, because there's a lot. One of them is that the North has a lot more railroad miles than the South has. The North has a lot more people, 23 million versus about 9 million people in the South, and part of those 9 million in the South are actually slaves, and they're not fighting. The North has better resources, better factories, and the South doesn't have factories. The North has so many factories, but they don't have a lot of fields and farming, not like the South does. But the problem in the South is that most of their fields are some rice, but they're mostly cotton and tobacco. And so that is also problematic because you can't really eat cotton and tobacco. You can wear cotton, that's what your clothes are made of, and you can smoke tobacco, but you can't really, it's not going to feed you. So looking at the next slide, North versus South. Most of the free land in the South is used by plantations, so it's not factories. The North is urban, meaning it's mostly cities, and the South is very rural, meaning not cities. And there's no reason for these southern plantation owners to actually build factories. If I own a store and along a road, and other people own stores along the road, and someone comes to me and says, will you help us pay for a new road so that more people can build more stores? I'm going to think, no, because if more stores are here, they're going to take business away from me. Right now, I control the business. And so the plantation owners did not have any interest in seeing new roads built because mostly they transported their cotton on rivers. So on the next slide, separating N and S, that would be North and South, 1860. And I just want you to take a moment and look at the numbers between the upper South and the northern and the lower South. And so on the left side, we see the upper South. There's 3 columns. One of them is the name of the state. The middle column is the number of people that are in the colony, in the state, that are not slaves. And that right column is the number of slaves in that state. And then you can look at the lower South on the right side of your screen, and you see the same columns. Now, look to the next slide where you see now 2 highlighted yellow states. those states, Mississippi and South Carolina, have more slaves than non-slaves. So why don't the slaves rise up and overthrow their masters? Well, that's a really good question, and that's a question that a lot of historians and social scientists want to know. But keep in mind that these slaves, they cannot read and write. And if they get caught reading or learning how to write, they can be beaten. And even if they get off the plantation, they don't know where to go. Which way is north? How do you read a map? It's very difficult for them. Plus, they were beaten so often, they come to think of themselves just as property. And that's how their slave owners thought of them. Now, go to the next slide that says demographics. Demographics is a word that we use in English to graph or to chart the different groups of people. So black people, white people, Latinos, Asians or Chinese, men, women, young people, old people. That's called demographics. How do we measure how many people in each of those groups there are? And if we look at this slide, the picture on the left is of something that we saw in part a little bit earlier in this chapter. It's the density of slaves in the 1860s in the United States. On the right side is a map of the United States in the year 2000. And that map, if you look closely, and you feel free to pause if you like, but that map, you can see that the African American population really hasn't moved very much. And so if you look at, for example, South Carolina, the concentrations, the dense places in South Carolina with African Americans are also in 2000 are also the dense places in the United States in South Carolina in 1860. The same is true in Alabama, in Florida. In South Carolina particularly, there's one little spot right in the middle of South Carolina in both 1860 and in 2000 where there's a less population, a smaller population of African Americans. And why is that? Look at the next slide and you can see this map a little bit larger. And I don't know the answer to why that is, but I believe that because when the slaves were freed, the people were poor. And poor people just don't move from one town or one state or one city to another place very often. But also the white people in the South were free. They were also poor. And if you look at, again, you're looking at this map, you see another color in these southern states that you don't see in the rest of the country. And that is a color the people say that they are American. And so this is a census map, which means that someone comes to knock on your door and they say, what is your ethnicity or what is your nationality? And in the South, the purple are African Americans, and they say African American. And in other places in the country, like the pink would be Latino. But the white is in the South, they say, I'm American. Other places in the United States, they don't say that as much. They'll say they're Norwegian or they're British or they're German. And so the South, the mentality in the South really has not shifted the way that they think. But what is interesting is that these people in the South say they're American when actually in the 1860s they tried to break away from America and create their own country. So this is a very interesting concept that you're looking at right here. All right, so let's look at the next slide. Slave owners. Often people think about the South and everyone owned slaves, but that's not true, actually. Everyone didn't own slaves. So many people, most people did not own slaves. Only 1/4 of white Southern families owned slaves, so 25%. And half of these owned less than 5 slaves. 3/4 owned less than 10 slaves. And only 1% of Southern families owned more than 100 slaves. So these pictures that you see of these big, magnificent, beautiful plantations, it's only 1% of Southerners that own those. And in the United States, we call these people the 1%ers, the richest people in the country, the top 1%. If you look at the next slide, you see a plantation. This is down in the South. It's called Melrose Plantation. So it's A lot of very beautiful plantations. And the next, so this Melrose plantation, this is what the slaves would have called the big house. And they would have done repairs on the big house. They would have not gone into the big house very often, unless they were a house slave, which means that they would have cooked, or someone that's repairing clothes, or a driver that drives the horse and buggy. But the field hands that worked out with the cotton, they would not have gone into the big house very often. On the next slide, you see a picture of the slave quarters, and this is a very typical house for a slave, and you'd have maybe 2 families living in that home, maybe only 1, depends on the plantation. But you can see it's much different from the big house. There was resistance. If you look at the next slide, it says slave culture, and there was resistance. There were slave rebellions, and one of the most famous slave rebellions in the United States was Nat Turner's rebellion. And you read about this in your chapter, and you need to make sure that you actually spend a few moments reading about this. Nat Turner's rebellion, 1831. And Nat Turner escaped, and he tried to gather other slaves to escape with him, and his idea was to rise up and kill as many whites as he could. He kills about 60 or 65 whites, and he's hoping that all slaves everywhere will rise up and rebel, but they don't. And as a result, no, he's executed, but as a result, laws are passed that prevent blacks from learning how to read and learning how to write, and laws that allow the slave owner to actually kill the slave if the slave gets out of line. But there's not that many slaves that are escaping every year. Maybe 1,000 per year successfully escape. Many more are caught. They try to escape, but they're caught and brought back to their slave owner. And when they're caught, they're beaten severely because, you don't want them to try to run away again. And if they do run away, they're going to fear being beaten. So the question is, why not more rebellion? Looking at the next, with the yellow highlighting here. Why not more runaways? Well, this comes back again to, where do you go? You can't read or write. You can't read a map. It's a long ways to the north where there's no slavery, but how do you get there? Who can you trust? So that goes a long way to explaining why there were not more rebellions and uprisings. And they didn't have any money. If they did run away, what will they do for money? And what if they have a family right there on the plantation? What if their husband or wife or brothers or sisters or family, mom and dad, and you run away and your family is there and you never see them again? And so it was very difficult to think about running away. Many wanted to, but actually doing it became very difficult to decide, I'm going to leave my slave cabin in the middle of the night and run away. And the last slide here is a picture of a slave, actually, just kind of a drawing of a slave running away, what it might have looked like. The slave would take a stick and put everything he owned in a cloth and tie it to the back of that stick and head on down the road. So there's so much more to talk about in this chapter. There's slavery and slave culture. There's so much actually to dig into here, but we don't want to take up too much time on the video. There's other material that you need to get into in the unit itself. So you guys have a great afternoon or great evening, and we'll see you next time right back here for chapter 17. All right, bye-bye.